this is pretty much the topic here of today. And first of all, I would just like to extend my deepest gratitude to all of you who take off an entire hour of your time to learn about the indeed very exciting topic about service mapping. And the title here, Demystified, it sounds very mysterious indeed, but essentially this is what we're going to speak about today. We have 1 hour together. That is not a lot of time for such a huge topic, so we will do our best to try and cover it all, I guess. But let's see here. For those of you who have not heard about us before, then perhaps I should start with introducing myself. My name is Alexander. I am originally Swedish, but these days I live here in Amsterdam. So actually I'm in my houseboat now. And yeah, I am very, very passionate about IT operations. Currently, I am the managing director of Einar Partners, where we are focusing on IT operations strategy. And in the past, I was actually working in the service mapping team at ServiceNow. Now, that was many years ago, but for you, let's say, old schoolers out there, you might recognize the word service watch. And that's really where my journey with service mapping started. So I am super excited to share kind of my input and my lessons here today. But luckily I have my good friend with me. So who are you, Fabian?
Thank you. My name is Fabian Kunzke. I'm also equally excited about today. Also very passionate about the ITOM topic because from my point of view, it oftentimes is a topic that gets overcomplicated a lot of times, and it loses the beauty of it. And I set myself the goal to essentially beautify it, make it the flower that it's supposed to be. And for me, the topic of today is especially exciting because service mapping is one of the examples where that actually happens, which is also why we came up with that name, because service mapping is in fact sometimes a bit of a mysterious word or slang, so to say. And it doesn't have to be that way. And we hopefully managed to do exactly that, demystifying what is behind that word, essentially, or the two words of service mapping, right?
Yeah, maybe we should mention here, Fabian, that first of all, for all of you on the webinar, this is being recorded, so you will be able to access this in retrospect. But more importantly, if you stay to the end, you will actually get kind of an opportunity, let's say, an invitation to speak with me and Fabian personally, meaning you can book a 1 hour free meeting with any one of us, no strings attached. But the reason we're doing that is because we know that there might come questions that we are not able to answer here. So you will get some links and instructions in the end of the webinar of, essentially how you can continue the conversation with us. And I think that's it in terms of information, right, Fabian? Then what are we actually going to cover today? Maybe you could take this part.
Yeah, let's hop right into it. So, you should also see my presentation now. No, you don't. Now you do.
Hopefully. Yeah, I do. Yeah, if you go to the next slide.
Great. So these are the four. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Always good to have someone who can tell you that you're actually showing the correct slide. So, what we are going to look at today is basically the idea behind service mapping, right? So we thought of structuring the next hour essentially the same way as a classical service mapping project or multiple projects would go. So we're starting off with the topic of initiating service mapping, right? So what does that mean? We will focus there on kicking off service mapping, bringing the idea into the organization and what that actually means and why it is important. We will then cover the step of preparing and planning such a project, which is oftentimes the most important part of service mapping projects. And then we will cover the implementation aspect. A short message at that point is within the implementation aspect, we won't go too deep into the technical details because we want to focus more on the overlying aspect of the part that actually needs demystifying at the moment. And the technical aspect has been very clear so far. And also we need to cover a lot of topics in just an hour. So we decided to leave the technicalities out a bit. Again, at the end of the presentation, you will get, or webinar, you will get the opportunity to talk to us directly, where we then also can dive a bit deeper if you want into these technical aspects. And then the last part will just be a bit of a review, just give you some ideas on how other projects with service mapping have been successful, and to maybe give you a bit of a hint or an idea for your own company. Okay, how can we actually get there? How can we get to where we want to go, essentially? And those 4 points will be the points of today, again in order of how a project might look like in that way. And kicking it off, I would actually hand it back to you again, with the organizational aspect. So with basically how can we as an organization interact with service mapping?
Sure. Then, yeah, like Fabian said, we're not going to reiterate product documentation here. So if you guys have not read a lot about service mapping before, yeah, there will be parts we deliberately leave out. And then, as Fabian also mentioned, in the end, we have actually done benchmarks, yeah, throughout our careers. So we have like 15 service mapping implementations where we can give some good and solid benchmarks to give just indications of a service mapping project. However, before we start with that, we just need to get to the basic. So why getting the organization on board is crucial. So this is called boarding the ship. And service mapping is a technical topic. However, I would like to make the statement here that more than anything, and this is so important, service mapping is a political battle. And I don't think everyone truly appreciates the, let's say, political battlefield behind service mapping. Because what is going on when you start with service mapping? So the product is meant for mapping IT services or application services, hence the name service mapping. And what I have seen in the past, based on my experience, in the beginning, when I started with service mapping, then many projects basically came to a halt. So they stopped outright. And it wasn't really because of technical issues or technical difficulties, but it was always due to the human factor. So what does that actually mean with a political battle? Always when I say this, then I always hear from people like, but Alex, wait, what? What do you mean with this political battle? And there are 4, let's say, very important elements here of this political battlefield. Because imagine that when you do service mapping, you essentially engages the entire IT organization. And what that practically means is that you will be speaking to service owners or application owners. You will be speaking to various infrastructure teams. There will be security into the picture. There might be enterprise architects into the picture. There might be consultants such as me and Fabian in the picture, and so forth and so on. Now, granted, this is true for a lot of different transformation projects that you engage, a large part of the organization, but it is especially true for service mapping. So, first of all, security. Often what we hear when we start with service mapping is that no whale will give access. Please go somewhere else. So being able to leverage the security discussions with security teams as you are mapping services is super important. Different teams and stakeholders, that is exactly what I mentioned. And what we often find out is that because service mapping haven't existed in the past, you will find different teams who have kind of tried to make their own way of service mapping. And it could be like Visio diagrams, it could be Excel sheets, whatever it is. But the problem with that is that these people then get very protective of these little babies that they have created, which contains a lot of IT information and dependencies and topologies and so forth. And that is usually what we also see, that these individuals are very protective of this data. And then you always have different teams into the play here. Now, if you're a global organization, there might also be regional differences. So if you are speaking to one region, they will prefer one tool compared to service mapping. And in another region, they have a different tool maybe, or they have a different opinion. So regional differences, especially in global rollouts, can really be a factor, because every region have an opinion on how IT services should be mapped. And then finally, what we often see is resistance. Like if I had $1 for every time I heard, I've never seen a successful mapping, like I wouldn't need to have the job that I'm having now. And what I mean with that is, so often do I encounter people that, and I understand them, I understand their perspective. Based on previous experiences, they've never seen like a truly successful automated way of mapping IT services. So they really then become like a stop, let's say. So these 4 elements is the first thing that I want to start off with when I speak about service mapping. It is not the technical dependencies. It is not, the granularity of the IT services or how they should be mapped from a technical point of view. It is to appreciate just how much coordination and politics go into a service mapping project. So I just wanted to make this clear and set the stage with this already from the start. And I think that was pretty much what I wanted to start off with, right? Fabian, would you have anything to add there, or what would you say?
Yeah, just for the stakeholders, and if you just go back one slide, I think what's really important to understand is also why the resistance is there, right? Because usually when I have service mapping projects, the biggest resistance isn't always from a management level or from a support view, but it's oftentimes from the people who are very knowledgeable about their administrative work in network environments, for example. So they know that there isn't a magical way that all of this happens, right? There has to be some work put in at some spots. And sometimes it can happen that the idea of service mapping being that magical tool that just is one click and then everything works, that alone, right, can lead to the resistance. And what can help is integrating these people into the project, making them to stakeholders, right? Finding use cases, and that will be the part that I will continue in a second now. Finding use cases that actually helps them to work with service mapping, give them a reason to be part of the project, to then let them actually see how service mapping works instead of just talking about it. Because it's a big difference if you talk about something or if you show something, right? Because if you can show it and if you get them involved, then it's not a thing that they need to talk about, but it's their thing that they work with. And that can really help.
A lot of this today, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe you could take it off from here, because I think this is an excellent entry point to your part here. So why don't you take it?
I will do so. So next part, setting the stage. So after we looked at the organizational part, which is a super important topic, I want to continue with in my point of view, the next part where you basically decide if this project is going to be successful or not. And that's setting the stage, the preparation phase. Because what I've found is that a lot of service mapping projects, and in general, other ITOM projects as well, live under the big advantage of being iterative projects. What does that mean? That means that you can start with something that focuses on one use case, and then you iterate over it and extend it to grow on a very natural way. Sometimes what that can lead to is the thought process of, oh, well, we have an iterative approach. So if we notice that something doesn't work, we can then work on it to make it work. And it leads to a discussion where you start to reduce the planning and the preparation to a minimum. For service mapping, the exact opposite is true. So if you go through the preparation exceptionally well, your actual implementation will benefit a lot. And this is something that I want to focus on in the next few minutes here. So these are the 4 points that I want to talk about. Starting off with a use case. I'm a huge fan, and people that work with me know that. I'm a huge fan of storylines. which is it's a fancier word for connecting use cases. So use case is just a part of a storyline. But if I have a storyline, it's an example on how a use case actually helps, right? So last time we talked about discovery, where I essentially said, instead of just saying, okay, let's discover all the Windows servers, make a storyline out of it. Find the one Windows server that doesn't match the configuration it should have. Right, now you have a storyline. And the same approach is true for service mapping. Before you think about what services do I want to map, get the use case down. Have a reason of why you want to do all of this. Why do you want to invest the time? What is the problem that you want to solve with service mapping? Grab a pen and a piece of paper, write it down. It doesn't have to be something complicated, right? To give you an example, let's say you want to do a service mapping approach or a service mapping project to improve your root cause analysis in the cloud environment space. That can be your use case. But now that you have a use case, everything else that follows in the preparation step can be laser focused on that use case, right? The use case is more important than the service list, because from that use case, we can now go into the portfolio and we can say, okay, if we have our use case, which are the services that we are actually interested in, right? So again, with that example of actually having a root cause analysis for all of our cloud infrastructure services, we now know everything that isn't cloud infrastructure, everything that has nothing to do with impact root cause analysis, right? So that isn't in a productive environment, maybe. Everything that is, well, basically outside of what we would use maybe customer side, we don't care about. Now, this is a very harsh thing to do, right? It can be, you can basically, sorry, pardon my English there, but you can look like an asshole if you set up a project like that and the first thing you do is actually tell everyone what you're not doing. But in service mapping, that is super important, because what you end up with otherwise is a project that goes over the same thing, the same service map over and over and over again, because you missed one small little part that someone thinks is important. And it might be, and this is where the iterative aspect comes in. So if you have a use case, the portfolio you want to focus on is laser focused on that use case. And it means that you, one, have a list of services that are included for that use case and connected to that use case. But you also have a list of services that are explicitly not. We will see that picture quite a lot in the other parts as well that are upcoming, that it's really important to also define what is not part of your project, what you do not care about at the moment. If you have such a list, yeah.
To jump in here, could you give a good example here, like in a concrete way? Are you saying then that, for example, we will only focus on production environments, but not on development and QA environments? Is that correct? All right.
Other example, if you are focused on actually just your cloud infrastructure, right? You would, for example, leave something out that is not connected to your cloud base. So maybe your DMZ. For one customer, right, it could mean, okay, we are not discovering our main server centers. For other customers who have a self-hosted cloud environment, it could mean that we are including that, right?
Yeah, makes total sense. Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. Okay, now that we're down to the services, now you have a list of services connected to use case, and you also have a scope of what is basically the thing that you need to fulfill your use case. And you also know what is outside of it from a service point of view. Now, the next thing is, for each of these services, and I like to call it the pen and paper approach. I don't know about you, Alex, but I've seen some service mapping projects where people are starting the project off with taking a lot of time going into a Visio document and starting to very detailed set up their service picture. Right. And yeah, I always thought of that to be kind of ridiculous, because you are doing a service mapping project to get that picture. So why should you spend a load of time to get to that picture? For me personally, what is important is and that's why I call it a pen and paper approach, is actually grab a pen, grab a piece of paper, grab a cup of coffee and maybe your service owner, and outline what your service looks like. What are the components, right? You don't need to put in the work to actually get all of the load balancers in. It's enough if you just say, okay, these are our load balancers. That's a component of our service. And with the width, you want to determine how wide you want to go with your service picture. So what that means is, it comes down to the exact example that you just threw in, Alex. We have to decide what part of the service tree we eventually just leave out because it's no longer interesting to us. It might have something to do with the service, yeah, but it's not catering towards our use case. To give you an example, if we have an application service that I don't know, gives us additional data for our service in a cloud infrastructure example, right? But it doesn't help us as a root cause analysis part, right? It doesn't actually impact in our upwards view of it. Then we can leave that out. That's the width part, right? And what we are left then with is a service tree where we know what components we have, right? And the key part is, for that approach, we now have all of our components also assigned to our use case. So we know that if we successfully map these components into the tree, we cater to our use case. So after the project, we can measure exactly that with our finished mapping. Have we fulfilled our use case? And that brings us to one last part that actually for me is really interesting. And it's the depth part, the quality. How much do I really want to know about each component? And to stick with the example of having a service mapping for our cloud infrastructure, customer facing, so productive cloud infrastructure environment, if I have the focus on an impact or a root cause analysis, all that I need to know, or the most important thing that I need to know, is that I uniquely identify each component, right? So that I know which component is connected to which service. I don't necessarily need to know all of the details of that component. I don't need to know how much RAM is in there. I don't need to know how much, what operating system it is running at the moment. For our use case of having a root cause analysis based on the infrastructure, cloud infrastructure, I just need to be able to uniquely identify that cloud infrastructure, which means that, as similar to the width part, in the depth, I can define for each component, what do I want to know, right?
Yeah.
And the interesting part there is, oftentimes in these root cause analysis part, and also the other way around, right? If you're doing service mapping for impact analysis, the most important information is uniquely identifying something and then having metadata. So who's responsible for it, who's doing support for it, maybe what are the knowledge articles. Those things oftentimes are more important than the technical aspects. But what you are left with after doing that, so after first writing down the use cases, then selecting your portfolio, then pinning the service tree, painting it on a piece of paper and framing it, putting it on the side of your wall, and then defining a depth for each of these components, what you're left with are two things. And these are really important, and I will explain why. The first thing is, you immediately get a bigger picture, right? So instead of just knowing what kind of business services you have, your business services are now connected to use cases. They are connected to people. These business service information is roughly drawn up. It is a very, it's not the clearest picture right now, maybe because you have an ugly handwriting or something like that. It's not the clearest picture, but you have a big picture of your service or infrastructure. You know where this project is supposed to be heading. You have an outline of what the exact map is. And that's really important, because the review step within your service mapping project, right? So after you did the implementation and you now want to see, is this map somewhat right? You can now compare that to what you actually set yourself as a target, to essentially what you drew on a piece of paper. And The other part is you also have a cutoff point. You prevent your project in the planning phase already. You prevent your project from running endlessly because you know where you want to go, right?
And I would just like to jump in here, Fabian, because first of all, the audience, we're getting some questions here. And one of the questions is it possible to ask questions? Yes, it is. You can write questions in the Q&A. And about this bigger picture thing, I find that so important because like you mentioned, typically seen, IT services doesn't just float isolated by themselves, but they are,
Yes.
connected to something. So for some people here, maybe it can be a little bit, not confusing, but when they hear business services, what does that actually mean? Well, it just means, if I understand you correctly here, Fabian, that whatever, this application or IT service is, must be doing something. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. Is that a correct understanding, Fabian?
Yeah, that's the idea behind the use case of connection.
Right. And I see here another very interesting question here. We only have 30 minutes left-ish, a little bit more, but I really think we should mention this out loud, because the question here comes from Nikolai, and he is asking, essentially, what do you do if you don't have architects who can help you kind of map the needed nodes and so forth?
That's a very good question. It's a very good question because it leads to my next point, right? The next result, which is essentially the bricklayer. It goes essentially exactly to that part of a component aspect, right? So for each component, you should have something, what I like to call a wanted poster, where you describe this is the component, and then you have the details for it. You also write down what kind of information you still need. So Nikolai, the output of that planning can also be that you are still missing some information. The worst thing that you can do at that point is essentially saying that you're ready. If you go at this approach and you see, okay, we have a service, but we don't know anything about that map yet, then you first, before you start off to actually implement service mapping, you should take the stakeholders and sit them together in a room, maybe a virtual room at the moment, and try to get the best possible idea of what you need to know about the service mapping or the service map at that point. Because if you do not have that picture to start off with, you do not know when you are actually finished with your service map, right? Even if you just have a rough picture, a rough list of components, it will help you, because if you have the components down, you know who are the stakeholders, who's responsible for that component, what kind of information do I need for that component, what technical aspect do I need to know. And that is the important part to really have a good planning strategy behind it. It also can mean that you say, okay, we're not going to focus on this service right now because we're missing too much information. I hope that answers the question. There are a lot of questions.
Exactly. We're getting a lot of questions here. And I think I want to pick one other here. We have to be a little bit disciplined about the question. So we will get back to some of you personally. But one of the questions is, hey, why do we need to draw things? Isn't that the purpose of service mapping? Yes, you are right about that. However, in order to map a service, we need to at least have a basic fundamental understanding of the most basic components of that service. And what does that mean practically? Well, for example, this service we know uses a load balancer. This service we know is a web service, so it uses Apache, it uses this. This service we know is also relying on databases, let's say a MS SQL cluster or something like that. You don't necessarily need to draw in detail how the service tree looks, but you must have an awareness of what are the components from a high-level perspective of the different services. Because otherwise it's very difficult to reach any sort of target or level of completion if you don't have that at least fundamental basic awareness. At least that is my take on it.
Yes, fully agree. There are some questions regarding CSDM and also timeline, and I think we at this point because timeline is something that you will cover in the next chapter, I think. I would say that we continue. I would take some time to just look at the questions and then come back to the questions afterwards, maybe if they fit in well. But to complete this point, right, the result two for the components and the brick layer, what you end up with now is, instead of having a list of services that you want to go through, that you have a rough idea of, you now have a component where you can rate the complexity based on the level of standardization, for example. So are you using components that ServiceNow already has a mapping pattern for? Is it some industry-wide standardized platform setup, or are you using a very individualized software? Is it maybe your own software that you have programmed or something like that? So you can rate a component based on its complexity. You can assign stakeholders to your component. You can have a priority for your components, right? Because one component can appear in multiple services. So you can also see how one component might be important to map first compared to another one. And you also know how long you will probably take to map that component based on these other factors. And that allows you to plan the timeline based on these component aspects. Alex, I would hand it over to you with the actual implementation approach.
Exactly, because I think this...
Go through some of the questions by either side.
Yeah. Can you see my screen, I presume,
yeah,
right?
I can see it again.
Okay, good. Let's just look at some benchmark, guys, and we'll get into these questions. And I didn't expect this many questions. There's clearly an interest in the best practices around.
Yeah.
But here are some benchmarks, I know there's a lot of things here on the screen, but what I want you to do right now, first to be aware of, is on the upper right side here. We have categorized here service mapping scopes in 3 different categories. Below 20 applications. Keep in mind here, one application can have many different application services. Then we have 20 to 50 applications, and then the bigger scope of over 50 applications. So that is what we have to work with. Now, here we have 2 axes. The first one is the complexity. And what do we mean with complexity? We mean pretty much how complex are the topologies. Is the service spread out in different data center, a mixture of on-prem versus cloud? What is the level of standardization of the technology? Are we using normal MS SQL things, Microsoft technologies, Oracle, etc., or are we doing something completely customized, which is kind of an off bet? So that is what we mean with complexity. If you have high complexity, then the application landscape is also very scattered and complex. Then, of course, the duration. I don't need to speak about the duration. We all know what the duration is. There's a lot of dots on the screen here right now, and I realize you probably are looking everywhere around. So I'm gonna remove some of them for you. And what I want to emphasize here are 2 interesting data points. So starting with these 2. How come that sometimes mapping over 50 applications with actually a higher complexity than what mapping below 20 applications is with a lower complexity can take almost the same amount of time? And by the way, this data here is real data. It's not just invented data, but we have actually benchmarked 15 service mapping rollouts in 6 different industries. And here is another very good example, which is this one. Here we can see a clear distinction of a high complexity case, where yet again the volume of services is higher, versus a very low complexity with a few services. So how come that duration is so impacted here, and what is the correlation? This is kind of what I have been scratching my head with a lot when I have worked with service mapping. And keep in mind, like in the beginning when I started with service mapping, then things took time. So why is that? Well, it all comes down to the modes of mapping, all right? So there is not one single truth here, all right? Sometimes one mode make more sense than the other, and it's not a black and white world, but there are ways, and I think Fabian touched upon it a little bit. what are central components, for example, and other things. So there are ways of just making these type more efficient, because it is about having a structured approach when we target and map services. So the traditional one, when I started with service mapping, it was called Service Watch. This was like 6-7 years ago. You mapped service by service. In average, a service maybe took, let's say 3-4 days. Doesn't sound that bad. But keep in mind here, a service, just think of a service as an instance of an application, all right? So what do we mean with that? Well, there is an instance, like a production instance, a dev instance, Q&A instance, and so forth and so on. And obviously, if it takes 3-4 days per instance or per application service, and if you're a big company, so you might have 300-400 application services, it is madness to invest 800 days of work on mapping services. So more efficient ways had to be developed. But this is the traditional mapping approach, where you do service by service. And sometimes this is a necessity, especially if the services are fairly unique in nature. I often see that, for example, for SAP systems tend to be quite unique. They look very special. So then you need to approach it on a service per service approach. But the other mode of mapping, and this is where it gets interesting and a little bit unorthodox, I would say. Let's look at some service trees here. There are patterns that we can see in how a service tree looks. So, for example, if we have 50 services, we know that maybe 20 of them starts with a load balancer. Then maybe 15 of them all have a web server component. So the services are actually web services, like a website that an employee is visiting or an external website that a customer is visiting. But it is some sort of web layer, like a web application. Think Apache or Tomcat, etc. And then maybe there is another pattern that 20% of these topologies, they are running some sort of containerized Docker solution. And then we, of course, have, pretty much 100%, but a large majority running a database layer. So I'm saying this because we can actually split up and look not at individual services by services, but we zoom the picture out and try to look for similarities between different services. So as I mentioned, for example, load balancers, web apps, Docker, databases. So why are we doing this? Well, first of all, it goes faster to map because we know that if we succeed in mapping the load balancer for one of these services, let's say an F5 load balancer, it is likely to work on other ones as well. And the same goes for the web apps and so forth and so on. So pretty much it's a matter here of, with the least amount of effort, getting the maximum amount of results, okay?
Yep.
But perhaps more importantly, this allows you to engage with the different teams way more careful and strategically. Because if you do service by service, every day you're gonna have to call the database guys. Every day you're gonna have to call, the people that are taking care of the load balancers. And there's gonna be so much ping pong game between you that it's not feasible. But doing it this way, you can actually reach out to the database team and tell them that, hey guys, we are now down on the database layer for 40 of our services. We need to plan 1 or 2 weeks of your time where we really target the databases in our service topologies. So that is kind of the gist of this. And I always like to make the comparison that when you do this approach, instead of getting 1 or 2 services really perfected, you will get a lot of services, let's say less perfected, but with more data in it. So to give like just a practical example, it's almost like in the beginning, the picture is a little bit blurry, and then after a while, it becomes more and more clear. So pretty much you reach here a completion of maybe 60 or 70% on a lot of services rather than 90 or 100% completion on a few services. And once you have that kind of bulk approach, then you can start approaching service by services and refine them further.
Yeah.
This is, from my experience, yeah, the way to go. I don't know, what would you say, Fabian?
Yeah, it goes hand in hand with what essentially is the output of the planning, right? Because if you have these overviews and you have these components, you can actually group them. And now I think the most important part is actually being respectful of the stakeholders. We have a question here from Stefan, who said that it almost sounds like enterprise architect related tasks. And that's absolutely true. And this is why you have to be so respectful about that. You have these, like oftentimes enterprise architecture people, they don't have a lot of time, right? But these are the important people to get on board. So the more structured your approach is, the better you can get them on board again, right? So I like this approach so much because it goes hand in hand with what we have just talked about in the first and the second chapter of getting your organization on board. And that means to actually be respectful with the time that they spend and try to get it down to efficiency of their time. So this approach allows you to essentially have a deck of cards with your components and approach them in a more efficient way. And I hope that answers the question for Stefan. I just wanted to jump in.
And what you say here about being respectful of people's time, like if we're looking at a service mapping projects for the people on the webinar, most of the time is spent on internal coordination. It is spent speaking to application owners, to enterprise architects, to different teams and so forth. Actually, a relative small amount of time and investment ideally would be spent on like consulting, for example. Yes, you need maybe consultants in the beginning to kick things off in the right direction and so forth, but the majority of the time and investment from a budget and duration perspective is internal. So therefore, you really need to be kind of clever and structured with how you approach the different teams, because if you're going to ask really busy people for their time, then you better be friends with them first.
Yeah, you better come around with a cup of coffee.
Yeah, exactly. And another problem that I often see is that when service mapping happens, I've sometimes seen that the rate of adoption is low. And what do I mean with that? It means that I have seen fantastic services mapped, but no one is using them. And that is madness. So I've been thinking a lot about this. How can we ensure that adoption of these services actually takes place? So it's not just a project, for the IT department and they map some services, but we truly see this being widespread and used. And secondly, like I said, we need to have an implementation approach that allows for smart resource allocation by both parties. And what I mean with that, I mean consultants and I mean the internal parties at whatever company you're working at. So this is a simplified approach here, but what I want to emphasize is on the left side, we have something what I just call service mapping what. So that means that the awareness of service mapping is low. The involvement of service mapping is low in the organization. People barely don't know about it. They maybe don't even care about it. And then oppositely on the right-hand side, it is when you really kind of create an enthusiasm around service mapping and people start seeing the value, and that's when different teams and different service owners starts asking like, oh, this was really cool, can we also get this in service mapping, can we also do that? So it's really a matter here of creating a culture around mapping services. And this always starts, like Fabian has explained a lot, with analyzing something. So you analyze the components, you analyze the topology layers, you analyze the type of services, the teams, whatever it might be. You do your homework a little bit. And then here is the preparation part, yet again, which Fabian mentioned. So this is a long preparation part, and I am aware of this. It's a bit unorthodox, but I call it setting the stage. The purpose of setting the stage is to reach out to stakeholders, to show them service mapping, what it is about, how it will help them, exactly what you need from them, how much time they need to invest, and what they get out of it. So it's essentially a way for you to be kind of a a diplomat about service mapping and show it to the organization, all right? Because here it's important to include people at an early stage. Why is that? Well, because when you include people at an early stage, they feel part of the process. And if you are part of a process, if you are part of shaping the future, you are more likely to use that process and to be happy about that future. If you just approach a team and say, hey, we're now going to map your services, we need the credentials and access, or we're going to map your components or whatever, then yeah, you're not really creating friends, you're creating resistance.
Yeah.
But setting the stage here, it's a variable component. So for some services and for some type of teams or technologies, it might take shorter time, and for other services, it takes longer time. And then of course we have the actual mapping part. I don't gonna go into that. And finally, embedding. So this is when you take those teams, those stakeholders that you spoke to in the beginning, and you show them the maps, and they start using the maps. Root cause analysis, impact analysis. They use it in change management. They maybe use it in incident management. Whatever it is, auditing, etc., etc. Because it would be crazy if you do all of these efforts and map everything, but like I said, nobody's using it. So the embedding part is so critical to not forget about. So removing the analysis from the picture and now just looking at the blocks we have in front of us, this is a modular approach to implementing service mapping. It is a repeatable approach which goes through regardless of what it is you want to map or how you want to map it. Do you do it service by service, technology by technology, shared components, central components? It doesn't matter, but follow this approach, because that is what I have as most success with. And this is how I've actually seen service mapping truly being used and embedded in the DNA of the IT organization. And that is super important. So I know I talked a lot right now, and I hope I didn't overwhelm people, but what will you say, Fabian? Do you agree?
Yeah, I actually want to use that exact part to maybe go into another question where someone was asking if you have large trees, service trees, is it a viable option to just start with a low approach is I think the question, or I would translate that to, is it an option to start with a subtree of a bigger business service, for example?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. It fully is. If it caters a use case and you're actually doing something with it, you can start with a tree as small as like 3 CIs, right? If you, for example, have event management and all you want to do is check if your applications are running, it could be that you literally just have your application layer and your virtualization layer in there. So if you have a use case that you are catering with that approach, go for it. I highly entice it. Again, because if you do it, it's not something you're going to throw out once you start with the bigger trees. Because at the end of the day, if you started off with that, as soon as you come and redo it, maybe with a bigger tree, you don't actually have to revisit that part. You should review it, of course, if it's still as true, but you can just use it as the foundation and build every other part on top of it. So yeah. if you have an option to do it and you actually use it, go for a low approach. Fully support
and what would you say, Fabian? Because I often hear this, that, well, service mapping doesn't provide any value if it's not 100% complete. And I say that is false, because what service mapping is about, it's just tying infrastructure to the application layer, right? Like in a nutshell, that is what it's about. So even if you just manage to map 70%, what that actually means is that 70% of the CIs, when you raise a change or an incident, you see what services they impact. So
I fully agree.
It makes total sense.
Yeah, for me, what I like to answer that is another question, is the question of why we do IT service management in general, right? Because it's a bit of a misunderstanding in my point of view. The 100% oftentimes refers to we have a business service and everything dependent to that business service is fully mapped now. But that's not IT service management in a nutshell. Yes, it has something to do with business services, but IT service management also focuses around the service management of maybe just one application service that another team is using, right? So mapping just a part of it can already give you a lot of benefits. For example, if you know what kind of databases are running on your SQL server, you can also, like that connection, that's a one-level connection, right? We're not talking about something big, but if you have that, you also know who to call if you want to change something in that SQL server configuration. Yeah. And that already can help you massively in the change management. So yeah, don't fear of taking a service mapping live that isn't 100%, because if you started off with a use case, it could be that maybe just 10% of the full tree already solves that problem that you want to solve. You don't need to be on a full mapped approach on that level.
Yeah, I love how you put that, because I think it's so true. We only have like 8 minutes left, so I realize that, you know, there's a lot to unpack here, and there's so much about service mapping we haven't spoken about. We haven't gone into how, you know, from a technical perspective, you actually map services and whatever. But you can reach out to us and we can explain this, or you can check the documentation website. But what I'd like to do now, together with you, Fabian, here, is quickly speak about 2 success stories that I have been working on, and also you, Fabian. So
let's go for it.
The first one, this was one customer case here, and they approached service mapping based on the infrastructure types. So pretty much here, the challenge was that they had a mixture of cloud and on-prem, fairly DevOps focused, you know, Kubernetes, Docker, Azure, DevOps, you know, the usual stuff. Quite a lot of operations partners. So that adds to complexity in the political battle, right? Because you need to be able to map services at different outsourcing partners. And then they had a central IT. So these guys here, 3 months start to finish, roughly speaking, not necessarily 100%, but enough to provide value. And the scope was really kind of platform as a service and on-prem services. So the things they had like in Azure and some of the on-prem stuff. We started off setting up a core team. So a limited proof of concept, selecting a subset of services to map. Then what actually they did was, in order to determine what would be the driver for mapping, they analyzed high ticket volumes. So what type of services are generating most noise? Because that is obviously where we should, you know, direct our initial focus. So it was really a matter of having data-driven decisions here. Then they mapped based on the infra types. Okay, so the infrastructure types that I spoke about before. So, you know, the component layers like databases, web apps, whatever it might be, in combination with these high ticket volumes. So pretty much the amount of noise and the amount of problems that determine the list of priority, and they combined it with having this kind of bulk mapping approach, and that really created a momentum for them. And after that, only then did they add important metadata. So what does metadata mean here? Well, it is what does this service exchange data with other services and so forth. And they integrated it with, like Fabian explained, the bigger picture. And as they were doing that, they were also allowed to phase out an old legacy tool, which basically was service mapping but manual. Customer case 2, I found this rather interesting, because this was a rollout strategy which was more regionally based. And in the end, they wanted to create an opt-in program for service owners. So there was a global organization that I worked with, and a lot of local IT teams. And each IT team had a great autonomy. So they were allowed to decide a lot by themselves. The service owners were allowed to decide by themselves. And of course, a big variation in buy-in. They also had kind of a driver here, a data center consolidation, but it doesn't really matter. The scope is what's important. They focused on core IT services and their production environments. So first thing they did, what is the feasibility? Small proof of value. We measure then the time to map certain things, and an end-to-end flow. And what we mean with that is, how does the entire flow works between service owners, the people that maps, the enterprise architects, how feasible is this? And then they started rolling out, we did some assessment here, we did some tweaks and benchmarks, but then we started rolling out service mapping for the core IT services. And these were central IT services, by the way, in a production environments. So the most critical services that the entire company was using and their production environments. Then, this is what I like. We actually created an opt-in program for service owners. So it was kind of a way to approach service owners and say, hey, if you want a certain maturity, if you want to reach here, we have a program for you. And I call it here the illusion of choice, because the kicker here was that the service owners were allowed to go with another solution if they could prove that it was more cost efficient and faster. However, in 99% of the cases, that wasn't the case. So that's why I call it an illusion of choice. Pretty much they always ended up with choosing then service mapping, because that was the sensible decision. And then finally, what these guys also did was that they connected event and monitoring data to these maps as a second step. So this is just some examples of how one might be able to approach service mapping in a real kind of customer-based case. And with that being said, I think we only have 2-3 minutes left here. So
yeah,
Fab, what would you say?
Yeah, I just wanted to, because of the time, I think I won't go through any more questions at this point, especially because some of the questions are actually good for a whole white paper. So will be or another webinar in itself. So two things at this point. What I really liked, especially on the last example, was just showing, okay, there is a way that you can involve your organization in a natural growing way, right? And this is where it comes back to the user stories and what I think is underutilized a lot of the times. If you have a marketing team, or even if you yourself like to write like some newspaper articles, take that ability and write a newspaper article about how the one project, the service map that you just mapped, how it fulfilled a use case, how you can now get more efficient, right? Make that transparent, because ITOM is something that very quickly can sell by itself, by just selling the storyline, telling the storyline. And I think the last example just shows that very well on that point.
Maybe we should mention, by the way, because I see we only have 1 minute left, and I want to be respectful of people's time, and I hate to just kind of quickly end the webinar, but there are a lot of questions. There's a lot to unpack here. This is just scratching the surface, but please reach out to us, and we really mean this. Like, we're not gonna do this from a sales perspective or anything, so no strings attached type of thing. Either scan the QR code right now for Fabian, or head to Einar.Partners/book, and you will directly be able to book a 1 hour, just a conversation session with either me or Fabian.
It's actually half an hour for me then.
Okay, yeah, maybe it's half an hour for me too. But in any case, we will love to discuss this more, right, Fabian?
Yeah, and of course, one important question that I definitely need to answer is the recording will be available with the presentation and a short summary. I hope in the next few days, so either tomorrow or on Monday. So you will be notified about that, because I just saw the question. We will again share, as the last time, we will share all of the material for the webinar with you.
Right. Yeah, super cool. Yeah, I think we did pretty well. Unpacking a lot of things here, probably Pandora's box. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Super cool sitting here together with you, Fabian. So much fun.
Always.
As always, yeah. And by the way, stay up to date with more webinars from us. Follow ITSM Group on LinkedIn or Einar Partners on LinkedIn, and yeah, you will just be in the loop for more of these type of sessions. So truly appreciate it, guys. Thanks a lot.
Thank you a lot, guys.